All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Tracy, and I'm here with Shane and our special guest, Dane Wigington. I know a lot of you guys are familiar with him and his work. He's been doing this for a very long time. I'm fairly new to this. Shane's been looking into these topics for a long time too, but I wanted to bring him on so that he can really break down the science, his research, so that those who are not as familiar with these topics could understand them better. If you're here for the live chat, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate your participation. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so before you leave. And like, comment, and share this video because a lot of this content is not going out to as many people as it should. These topics are highly censored on my channel. YouTube is not promoting it the way other topics are. So I'm really relying on you guys to share this information, especially with those who are have not been open to understanding this type of technology. So with that, I will introduce Dane. Dane, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. So why don't you introduce yourself and explain the work you do and what it means for the world?
It's a pleasure to join you, Tracy, and you, Shane, and thanks so much to you both for your voices in this desperate battle that too few yet know about or understand. This is not a job I wanted. The last 20 plus years, nonstop in this battle. When I say nonstop, I mean nonstop. I've never left my station in the last 20 plus years. I grew up in Southern California, very smoggy, wanted to desperately get out of that environment, moved to Northern California as soon as I was financially able to, large off grid home, solar, wind, and hydropower in the middle of the wilderness, Tracy and Shane. And no sooner was I done with this large system and I was losing 50% of my solar power from whatever these aircraft were emitting. I have a background in commercial renewable energy. I work for Bechtel Power Corporation. It's a corrupt company. I left at a young age because of that. But I thought if these kinds of programs are going on, I would have known it, but I didn't. And when I started to investigate, found mountains of data, looked at primary climate engineering elements, starting with aluminum nanoparticles, began to test my rain. Didn't want to find it, but I did. And over 18 months, because I took about 18 months of research before I was willing to speak out on this issue to make sure that I had done my due diligence on this. And the tests went from an initial 7 parts per billion of aluminum, which was already high given my filtered forested location, according to hydrogeologists. 18 months later, I had tests as high as 3,450 parts per billion of aluminum. That's highly toxic rain. I was simply faced with a choice, and I can't look the other way. I can't. It's not in my nature. So I've been at this for 20 plus years trying to sound the alarm on literally what is the greatest and most immediate threat we collectively face short of nuclear cataclysm. It's not just destroying the planet's remaining life support systems, but it's contaminating virtually everything, including every breath we take.
So can you elaborate more on these chemicals and how it affects our everyday lives as well as the soil and other aspects, like the most important things that we should be aware of?
What we know is in the mix from extensive testing, and we've worked with not only former government scientists, but also major internationally recognized institutions like University of Minnesota, Rensselaer Polytechnic in New York, aluminum, barium, strontium, manganese, polymer fibers, surfactants, graphene. And many of your listeners may know what graphene is. It's used for a multitude of purposes. It's when it's inhaled, it's like a vascular machete. Why would they use graphene? We found specifically, and I'll tie this into what's happening right now in the US, we found ice nucleating patents specific for climate engineering that specifically contain graphene. So again, they don't care about the consequences. When you have a global power structure that has very openly stated they want to thin the herd, they want to dramatically cull human populations, why would they care if they're using something toxic to accomplish that? They don't care. And if I double back to the aluminum part of the equation, aluminum is named in climate engineering patents. Why would they use aluminum? Because it's high reflectivity. Stated purpose of climate engineering, solar radiation management, stratospheric aerosol injection, to put a reflective light scattering particle into the sky to slow down the incoming thermal energy, to slow down the warming of the planet. And if your listeners take the time to watch The Dimming, our groundbreaking documentary on climate engineering, which we spent well into six figures producing that. We posted it for free the day it was done. It's for free on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org. In that film, they can see me confronting the world's most recognized geoengineer at an international climate conference as to his proposal of dumping tens of millions of tons of aluminum nanoparticles into the atmosphere annually. His initial response was, when I asked had they done any toxicological studies, they only allowed several questions, and they, by the way, banned me after my question from future conferences. So they're trying to censor this. But his initial response was, Tracy and Shane, there's a lot of particulate matter in the atmosphere anyway, like a little more won't hurt. And before they cut me off, I followed up with, those particles aren't aluminum. Have you studied aluminum? And he paused, and then he said, no, we haven't. Could terrible things happen tomorrow? Quote, we don't know. And your listeners can see that exchange on The Dimming. Bottom line with aluminum, and again, we have all these other toxic elements as well. But aluminum, if your listeners don't know, it's toxic to all life forms, period. Bioavailable aluminum, that's the key term, which is what we have now, thanks to climate engineering everywhere. Toxic to all life forms, no exceptions.
Can you explain on how the atmospheric or aerosol injection aids in the weather manipulation we're seeing? Because that's something that Shane and I, delve into very deeply. Can you make the connection between that and the unusual rain, fog, freezing rain that we're seeing right now?
It's connected to all of it. In fact, at this point, it is not a reach to say there is no natural weather. Once you taint the system, you taint the entire system. So in the case of drought deluge scenarios, climate intervention operations core to both. And for those that don't realize it or haven't researched this issue, climate engineering is even more effective at causing drought than deluge. We have historical precedent for the deluge part. We can go back to the Vietnam War in the 60s. Project Popeye, again, historical record, that they were so successful at causing deluge over Vietnam that in the 70s they passed INMOD treaties, environmental modification treaties, forbidding weather warfare. Not that any government pays attention to those treaties, but if we go back even to the early 60s, at the beginning of the geoengineeringwatch.org weekly commercial-free, non-political update that we put out on AM and FM stations, we pay for that airtime, no commercials there either. Global Alert News, it's on our homepage, but the first 15 seconds is film footage, and Tracy and Shane, maybe you've seen this, but it's film footage of President Lyndon Johnson in 1962 ranting like a maniac, stating we had the power to control the world's cloud layer then, and quote, he who controls the weather controls the world, because you can control precipitation, thus food supplies, thus population. You can make that precipitation toxic. You can use it for biological warfare, all of which is occurring. So in the case of drought, Tracy and Shane, and I have presentations going back over a decade on the drought-causing effects for the West Coast, California, engineered drought catastrophe, target California. When you introduce too many condensation nuclei, too many particulates in the atmosphere, the droplets don't combine and fall as rain. They simply migrate. So Tracy and Shane, have you seen more days now where there's a featureless cloud canopy, no rain falling, bone dry underneath? You've seen those types of days now, right?
Right.
And we've seen that, for example, if we go back to the beginning of geoengineering in the polar regions, people think polar skies are supposed to be that way, these featureless white skies. No, that's because they've been geoengineering there since immediately after World War II, and now they're doing it at lower and lower latitudes, and now we see it. Too many condensation nuclei, rain doesn't fall, migrates somewhere else. If you change the size of the condensation nuclei, and frequency transmissions are likely a part of this, that can cause these particles to either disperse or coagulate and make a larger particle, which would then cause deluge scenarios. So it depends on what you're seeding and how you're manipulating that seeding. And on the deluge, we saw what happened with Helene. You guys probably also saw what happened in Dubai. Did you see that a few months ago in August?
The flooding.
Is it a coincidence that a week earlier, Dubai basically announced they would get rid of the US dollar and we're disconnecting from certain US policies, and a week later they get 2 years worth of rain in a few hours? So Again, this is the crown jewel weapon of the controllers, the weapon with which they can and are bringing populations to their knees without those populations ever even knowing they're under assault.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now,
Speaking of the featureless clouds, one of the few features I do tend to see on a regular basis is what I would call frequencies or waves. I've heard the meteorologists term them gravity waves. It's one of the only features I've really seen in these otherwise featureless clouds.
Yeah, you're so right. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up, Shane. This quote meteorologists, the script readers, and if I can elaborate on that for a moment, that they're literally reading scripts that are passed down from the top from Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, private defense contractors that are neck deep in climate engineering patents and operations. They do all the modeling for the nation's weathermen. Why would you have private defense contractors doing the modeling for the nation's weathermen? National Weather Service and NOAA, both agencies have illegal federal gag orders on them. That script ends up all the way down to the local meteorologist that says whatever he's told to say because his paycheck and pension depends on that. About the quote gravity waves, again, these people are making it up as they go. If anybody understands what that term actually means, they'll know how absurd that excuse is. And when we see overlapping, sometimes you can see these herringbone patterns, again, frequency transmission signature, overlapping in perpendicular directions. That negates anything the local meteorologist says. And what that is overlapping frequencies from different transmitters that are being used to manipulate the electrically conductive particles in the atmosphere, period. So that's one of the means in which they, because it has a repelling effect, can scatter these particles over a much wider area. That's the goal of solar radiation management. And again, this mix of transmissions, toxic particles, we're living in a fishbowl, and the vast majority have no idea the severity of threat posed by what's occurring in our skies. And to carry this even further on the frequency part, Shane, we have Project Lucy and Project Alamo. Those are acronyms. Now that we have enough heating on the planet where we have methane expulsions happening from the seafloor to the tundra, and if your listeners have never, if they want to see a visual of what I'm talking about, if they search Siberian methane craters, you have to see those images to believe it. It looks like nuclear bomb detonations in the Siberian tundra because those areas are heating and this methane is releasing. These entire fields are releasing, and it's craters 300 feet wide and several hundred feet deep. That's happening on the seafloor, has been for decades. That's what the Bermuda Triangle scenario is. Seafloor methane deposits releasing, aerating the water like a bottle of champagne. If there's a vessel on the surface, it goes to the bottom intact. So this methane goes into the atmosphere. It's covering the planet like a layer of glass because it traps heat very effectively. And so back to the frequency transmissions, Project Lucy and Alamo, now they're in an unbelievably desperate and dangerous attempt to degrade that methane. They're microwaving the atmosphere with opposing frequency transmissions in the attempt to molecularly degrade the methane while they're using other frequency transmissions at lower levels to manipulate the weather. This is a true circus of insanity, Shane.
Yeah.
so that
And they
made
do look
me
like,
perk up. The
go
Bermuda
ahead.
Triangle, the disappearing planes and boats. You feel like that is a result of the geoengineering.
Well, let's back up.
Okay.
It's a result of the heating of the planet, which climate engineering, in the attempt to hide it, is making it worse, not better. So as the planet warms, it takes a small temperature rise on the seafloor to destabilize methane hydrate and clathrate fields, and those fields tend to erupt all at once. And this is very accepted science consensus at this point. And again, picture all that methane rising through the water column, bubbling, and it reduces any buoyancy for any surface vessel, and they go to the bottom intact. And this has been, scientific experiment has been done showing this exact scenario I'm describing. And that's certainly what's been happening. And we have atmospheric methane counts now as high as 4,000 parts per billion. And that's about 6 to 7 times higher than it's been for several million years. So when people talk about greenhouse gases, they only talk about CO2. And that's just a triggering mechanism that triggers other feedback loops. And methane is a massive one. I encourage you listeners simply to search Siberian methane craters, look at those images. That will shock them to the marrow. That's happening on the seafloor on a scale 10 times bigger or more. And we've triggered mechanisms on the planet that are now truly a problem. And I know many justifiably so, feel great disdain for the hypocrisy of the environmental groups. I feel the same toward them. They won't address climate engineering because they don't want to lose their 501 nonprofits. We've had their attorneys tell our attorneys that at geoengineeringwatch.org. We're not going to address the biggest, worst environmental issue of all because we don't want to lose our nonprofit. Is that
Yeah.
not criminal hypocrisy? So I want people to just try to eliminate the biases that come from the justifiable disdain toward environmental groups, but to realize that we do have a problem, a very big problem, and climate engineering is making it worse, not better.
And something that I noticed, and a lot of my viewers gave me feedback right after Helene, other channels such as ours that report on the weather, very large channels, millions of subscribers, the same day, they all of a sudden cut out any comments relating to geoengineering and called those comments stupid. And I actually put a short of you talking about the gag order. So how does that gag order affect like channels such as this that are reporting on the weather? I'm just curious.
Same core of power behind it, two different mechanisms, if you will. The gag order and National Weather Service and NOAA is for all agency operations. It's not specifically, they don't specifically cite geoengineering because that would be a huge red flag by itself, would it not? So it's
Mhm.
just simply a blanket gag order. I've had a NOAA scientist at the Marine Lab on the US West Coast state to my face at that lab, quote, "We all know what's going on. We have no First Amendment protection. We don't know what to do." You have others within the system that will say whatever they think they need to say, again, to preserve their status. This is like the medical industrial complex still doubling down on the quote safe and effective narrative,
Yeah.
which we know couldn't be further from the truth. So again, for people to think that they can't conduct operations on this scale and not have lines of whistleblowers, why would we expect whistleblowers? How many have we seen in regard to the safe and effective? And we know, for example, with the illegal torture that our nation conducted, John Carrico, who blew the whistle on it, a
Went to
government
jail.
official, who was the only one to go to jail, the only one, the whistleblower. So why would
Right.
we expect people to line up and devastate their own lives? We're not going to see that. But if we don't deal with this issue, Tracy and Shane, we're not going to have much left to salvage soon. And I'm not saying if we do fix this, our problems are over. They're just beginning. But this is the single most devastating, damaging, dangerous human activity of all at this point. Greatest threat we face short of nuclear cataclysm. And even then, because climate engineering is destroying the protective layers of the atmosphere, starting with the ozone layer, and we're metering that, so we're not guessing. Now we're very susceptible to a CME, coronal mass ejection, solar flare. If we have a
Mm.
big one like the Carrington event in the 1800s, that will shut grids down around the globe. We'll have nuke plants everywhere that can't cool themselves. Now we'll have a whole lot of Fukushimas.
Mm.
Game over. So again, from every conceivable direction, climate engineering is pushing the walls in on all of us.
Okay, and I know we have a lot of people from the West North Carolina area and Tennessee who
Mhm.
want to know what the proof is that Helene was engineered to do what it did.
What I would encourage them to do is to look with their own eyes at what we have captured. And we have access to data loops that I'm surprised we still have access to, the NextRad transmission network. And we've captured not only Hurricane Helene, Hurricane Ian, Maria, Michael,
Mhm.
Harvey. If your listeners search geoengineeringwatch.org hurricanes, they can see the actual real-time interaction with these transmission networks, which have a repelling effect on the air mass with the storm and the electrically conductive particles that have been seeded into it. So it tends to be able to push the storm depending on where those transmitters energize. And you can see it in real time. Where they energize, the storm moves away from. Where they de energize, it moves toward that direction because it has no resistance. We can speculate, Tracy and Shane, on the agendas and objectives being carried out. But the fact that these storms are being steered with patented technology, beyond dispute.
And I know
Absolutely.
you did a couple interviews post Helene about um, the call you had with the representatives from those affected areas. Is there any follow up as far as what has happened since now that the people in charge or I think the senators and congressmen, he said up to even up to Maine, are now informed about what's happening? Has there been any other changes since since they know this?
Yes. Yes. There's potential legislation in motion in 23 states now. And we have regular contact with them and have worked with part of the drafts with some of those states, encouraging them to keep it simple, as Representative Monty Fritz did in Tennessee. Monty's a very honest, sincere individual, and he very strategically kept that draft extremely simple. Do you want to be sprayed with toxic elements as part of climate engineering operations? Who would consent to that? And he kept it nuts and bolts, and that's why it passed. That's what we need for other states, and that's what they're following suit with. And although this cannot be enforced, this is national security. This is at the top. This is above any law. And the funding for this, again, these are black ops. They don't need our tax money. They can print whatever they want. That's how the system works. For those that don't know how the monetary system works, we have the central bankers that can print whatever they want for whatever they want. Funding's not an issue. The only thing that's going to stop this is when we raise enough public awareness where every single citizen realizes they're sucking up these nanoparticles with every breath they take. Their children are. This is an immediate existential threat. We need to reach the pitchforks and torches moment. And when we do, those participating, those that are being told you're doing something good, it's benevolent, it's necessary, which couldn't be further from the truth, we can stop these programs perhaps from the inside out. But in regard to what passed in Tennessee and what the other states are working on, why it does matter, even though it can't realistically be enforced, it's symbolic, and that matters, and it gains media attention, and that matters. The Tennessee legislation gained international attention, as did even my exchange with Robert F. Kennedy. He interviewed me for an hour, and some important people requested that exchange to take place. And I know that because they called me as well. There's important people that want this issue out and in the open, and it will take all of us to do that. And I want to stress that as the editor built into the end of the dimming based on comments I'd made in many broadcasts. But my point at the end of the dimming, the epilogue, that any one of us could be the last pebble to trigger the landslide of awakening. And we are all needed in this battle. All of us are spokes in this wheel, all of us necessary to make it roll.
Amen.
Well, you know what, let me wait for the what we can do. But Shane, was there anything else on the more like scientific side that that stream of the black, seemingly black line and then the white? Can you explain, Dane, how that happens? How it looks like there's like a black stream of smoke? And
It's perfectly parallel with the aircraft. And what we encourage people to consider in every instance we've looked at, this is simply a shadow, a refraction that can reflect off an upper layer of reflected particles and back down to a lower layer. And it looks like there's something extending out in front of the aircraft, but it's in fact, depending on where the sun's at and where the reflection is, it is simply a result of those factors. So what we would encourage people to focus on, what we can actually prove, because we have film footage of it, the dispersion of these particles. When we have up close film footage of these aircraft at altitude, nozzles visible, turning dispersions on and off, that's the end of the debate. This is not condensation, it's a sprayed dispersion. We have up close photos of these nozzles, retrofit nozzles mounted on the wing pylons, aimed into the exhaust jet stream to make this look like condensation. And again, encouraging people, look at the jet spraying section at geoengineeringwatch.org, and there is no rational denial of what's happening in our skies. And Tracy and Shane, you've heard the common excuse from the quote experts, same kind of experts that would tell us quote safe and effective in another arena, but they tell us, oh, it's just different layers of atmospheric humidity that cause it to look like the spray's been turned on and off and on and off. The atmosphere doesn't layer vertically, it layers horizontally. You're not going to get that kind of effect, period. It's not possible. And if you see researchers in the Arctic or Antarctica and their breath is condensing, do you see a big cloud starting to form over their head? No. Condensation doesn't do that. So again, this is a particulate dispersion, and we've calculated, I'll leave it with this, but on the amount of material being dispersed annually, working with University of Minnesota and hundreds of lab tests, extrapolating the amount of material that's being dispersed over that state and projecting it globally, it appears that something in the range of 40 to 60 million tons of nanoparticles are being sprayed into our skies annually. So all this discussion from pollution agencies about reducing particulate pollution, well, they're the single biggest source of the most dangerous particles by far, and nobody says a word because there's no regulation for it. That is truly a dangerous place to be. And it's up to the public to hold these officials accountable, because right now they're not.
Right. And then Shane, I'll let you kind of go into ask some questions about the fires and how this is making the fires do what they're doing.
Okay. Yeah, just real quick, I wanted to touch on the frequencies and the intersection of the two different angles of frequencies. They definitely look like interference patterns. I've also thought that for a long time. And then now we can actually, confirm that when we see the NexRad footage. Another thing too about pushing the wind with the frequencies, there is a technology called ionic wind or electric wind, which is the phenomenon that's produced with those like bladeless fans. And this is a similar phenomenon that can be scaled up to the mesoscale level, for, controlling the weather actually. And so a lot of times when you see those frequencies pushing the wind, that's electric wind or ionic wind. It's an electrostatic repulsion of sorts. So yeah,
Completely
now
correct. Correct. If I could add one more to that,
sure.
if we had another form of frequency transmission that can augment that as well, ionosphere heaters like HARP, if you're creating a pressure zone somewhere, other zones at different pressures will try to balance that out, and that will also augment that surface zonal wind flow, which we see all the time now, don't we? It's either now we have winds that are all or nothing. And this is, again, all a result of climate engineering and the processes you described, the ionosphere heater as well. And so people need to understand they have that kind of control over environmental systems that are now being used as weapons, period.
Yeah, and I think we saw a combination of all of the above pretty much on Maui back in 2023. You had the wave patterns in the clouds, which were termed gravity waves, although they were probably some sort of interference pattern. Right. You also had the stratospheric aerosol injection going on beforehand, which was a desiccant, if not an accelerant. Yes. And regardless of the ignition source, you do have all these different elements that come together when it does come to the Maui fire.
Exactly. Yes, fully agree. And even before that, the preparation for that fire to burn with such ferocity. So we know Maui was declared a flash drought zone a week before those fires happened. We know they can cut off precipitation extremely effectively. And we found at geoengineeringwatch.org a military document titled Forest Fires as a Military Weapon, 140 pages long, describing exactly the kind of preparation that we know went on the Maui region, again, cutting off of precipitation, drying out of the foliage, all described in this document. And what's most alarming about this document is there were about 18 sites within the continental U.S. named as part of that study. Why would the U.S. military name sites within our own borders? And again, it's profoundly alarming. And people think our military wouldn't do this to us. We know, according to the Washington Post, as of 1977, that far back, that the U.S. military had conducted no less than 239 open-air biological tests on innocent, unknowing U.S. civilians. How many have been carried out since? This is business as usual. It's just like Agent Orange in Vietnam, where our pilots told this is going to kill your comrade on the ground. No, they weren't told that. So the bottom line is this is compartmentalization, and for people that want to convince themselves that those who truly control our military wouldn't use it for these purposes, time to wake up.
And it did remind me of a lot of reports before the fire, like the day or 2 days before, there was a white haze, and I think it left some sort of was it a sticky?
Yeah, actually, so we had a Lahaina resident that told us the day before the fire and even during the fire, as they were trying to flee, the ground seemed to be covered with a greasy substance, as what they said. And this was directly after there was a haze that rolled in for the couple days prior.
What do you think?
Well, Shane, you correctly stated that. I mean, these are incendiary particles, period. Not just any incendiary, but in the case of aluminum nanoparticles, it's such an effective incendiary. We know that it's used in thermite, a military demolition material. So, I mean, You have a dried out forests and foliage, incendiary dust on top, convection zones that can be controlled. So you can create, in the case of Lahaina, for example, you can create a bellows effect, and that's exactly what they did. Primitive cultures have been melting steel for millennia with the bellows effect. When you feed enough oxygen into that fire, the temperatures go through the roof. So when you have horizontal 60, 70, 80 mile an hour winds like in Lahaina, incendiaries, dried out everything, you create much higher temperatures than you would normally see. So even in the case of, we've seen a lot of people talk about glass melting and so forth. You can melt glass in a campfire. That's bottom line is I've done it. Okay. So it's that it can happen there. And some of the softer metals like aluminum melt at low temperatures as well. And when you add everything we've just talked about, the preparation for this, we had north of Maui, we had a
High
very
pressure.
anomalous, what's that?
Well, north of Maui was a high pressure zone, but it
Yes.
also had the interference pattern. And then south of
Yes.
Maui was
Yes.
the low pressure hurricane.
Hurricane Dora. Yeah, thank you. Exactly. Spinning opposite directions. And although you're out of those immediate wind fields, you still create that tunnel, that wind tunnel between the two that helps to feed that. And you're exactly right. You have a bellows effect, a blowtorch effect, if you will, and then we end up with Lahaina. So there's nothing natural about that whole scenario. And again, whatever the source of ignition, and what I would like to stress with people when we're trying to gain credibility on this issue, we can speculate on ignition sources. It could be anything, could be any government shill with a match. But the bottom line is what's setting the template for these fires to burn with such ferocity, and that is definitely climate engineering. And if we focus on the facts that we can definitely prove, that's where we gain credibility. Because many have looked at, in fact, where there's a house standing next to a tree that didn't burn and that kind of thing, and they get off on a tangent there. I pulled, living trees don't burn. That's my father was an arborist as well, and I did that work as a child too. And you have a cambrian layer, living layer in a tree. They don't burn if they're alive, and they can be burnt. They can be scorched, as we see forest fires with hills with standing dead timber that's all black. Trees burnt dead, but it doesn't burn to the ground. It can't. And I pulled up pictures from the 1923 Berkeley fire. We certainly know we didn't have any of this technology then. And exactly the same, especially with redwoods, which are very fire resistant. You can have a pretty intact looking tree next to a bare slab. And a redwood is a very unique tree in that sense. It's not pitch based, so it doesn't burn. So I'm just trying to point out, or you see a lot of trees burning on the inside, and people have speculated a lot about that. I've fought wildland fires on the front lines, running equipment with CAL FIRE. And I mean, this is something I know about. And because this toxic element, aluminum, has killed soil microbiome, it's killing root systems. The bark scorch from the intense UV is literally burning the cambrian layer off many of the hardwood trees on this unexposed side. So we have this huge core wood exposed, which then dies, and you have a rotting of the inside of the tree. And any ember that blows will light that core on fire, and it'll burn all the way up through the tree. And that's simply a result of climate engineering overall, more so than anything else. And a lot of eclipse that if they speculate on other things. And that's one of the issues that, as we spoke off the air, that's kept CAL FIRE officials that I know about this issue. They won't address it because they don't want to be tangled up with other narratives. But I've seen trees in the forest that they literally look like a torch because they've rotted out on the inside for the reasons I cited. They ignite at the bottom. They're open at the top. You get a draft through that tree, and it's literally blowing fire out the top like a torch.
Yeah, those palm trees. Yeah,
seen it with my own eyes.
Yeah.
So again, what I would suggest for people to take into account is the primary foundational element here, and this is not to negate the danger of what we face. It's to stress how dire the situation is. Climate engineering is destroying the web of life, and with the forest, they've shut their stomata. The forests don't smell like forest anymore. The stomatas, the respiratory ports, they're not breathing. They're not absorbing carbon. They're not producing oxygen. The roots are, Shane and Tracy, you see how many trees are tipping over every time the wind blows now?
Mm-hmm.
Because their root systems are dying back from it's literally toxic rain. So I would just argue that any conversation we have about weather anything or fire anything should start with climate engineering.
Climate engineering. That I've been trying to figure out how the fire starts from the roots in the ground and then goes up, but
Well,
okay.
I haven't seen, now again, you can, um, we haven't seen any scenario like that. And I know some have claimed they've seen that. I haven't seen that. I manage a 2,000 acre wildlife preserve surrounded by forestry. And again, I've fought forest fires on the front lines in equipment. I work with scientists from USDA, CAL FIRE, Fish and Game. But you do have, because these rotting roots extend out considerable distances, we have scenarios where, for example, even after they put a fire out, if you have that type of rot occurring in a tree, that can smolder through those root systems for weeks or months and eventually burn out and surface elsewhere. And that's really the core of that kind of scenario that we've seen. So again, ultimately it comes down to, as Shane described earlier, we have the drying out of these regions, incendiary particles, and we have extremely low humidities because of that desiccant particle drying out. All of these roads lead to climate engineering, and we have an engineering wildfire section on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org for that reason. And let me leave it with this. If your listeners search wildfires serve geoengineering agenda, one of our most important short reports, we found peer-reviewed study advocating for the intentional burning of northern latitude forest to put enough particulate matter in the air to provide temporary cooling, mimicking a volcanic eruption. How insane is that? We're going to burn the last of our forests to temporarily cool down certain regions. So when Canada started, you guys remember the big fires in Canada?
Jasper,
Oh, well, lots of
Fort
them.
McMurray.
Yes.
Lots of them. The one where we lost, I think, so was it 70? It was
Alberta.
71,000 square miles, I think, in 22. That's bigger than the states of Florida or Georgia. When those fires first started, that smoke bank was blown right down over New York City, dropped temperatures about 25 degrees, pushed down on the surface from the type of electrical manipulation that you described, Shane, and that smoke bank was held there. But that smoke can circulate around the globe 2 or 3 times, two or 3 months. And so when you have peer-reviewed study advocating for the burning of the forest for a form of climate engineering, we're close to the end at that point.
Okay, one last thing I wanted to get your feedback on is, now that I'm aware of this, and every time I bring this topic up, once you say chemtrails, they automatically tune out. What can you say to open up a conversation that won't automatically turn someone off from discussing that?
We would suggest climate engineering, Tracy. It's very straightforward. That's a simple term. People understand it. The term geoengineering sounds almost like something to do with something terrestrial or earthwork type scenario. Climate engineering, very straightforward, but it doesn't hurt to know the other terms: solar radiation management, the intentional blocking of the sun to slow down the warming, stratospheric aerosol injection. But climate engineering is a good one. Chemtrails is fine if you're in a personal discussion with somebody, but if you're in any kind of government official office, media, any official agencies, they will stop talking to you at that point. And again, we need to play chess well, as we discussed off the air. Semantics do matter in this situation. And what many are, unfortunately, even on some online sites, like with the cooling we have happening right now, these flash freeze cool downs, many are claiming somehow that's a sign of global cooling or coming ice age. That couldn't be further from the truth. That's climate engineering. So let's call it what it is. And it's chemical ice nucleation, cloud seeding for weather modification. We have the patents for this. We've tested the materials. It's in the material. It's a very different material than naturally nucleated snow, and it tends to sublimate. It tends to be very slippery. Tracy and Shane, have you seen how many accidents happen now from people who thought they knew how to drive in the snow?
Mm-hmm. This ice.
It's like soap-soaked snow, and in fact it is. There's surfactants in this mix, which is what makes soap soap. Why would they use surfactants? Because it keeps the stated purpose to keep the particles from coagulating together and sinking to the surface faster. But have you guys ever seen foaming rain? Running down a street, you'll see foam in a gutter and foam. It's that type. I mean, it has to hit the ground and run off. But in mountain streams and Along coastlines, we see massive foaming events where there's 10 feet of foam.
Yeah, like
It's
when the
surfactants.
waves are crashing.
Yes, I have seen what appears to be surfactant effects
And they
producing
talk
not
about
only foam,
pollution.
but also it does give like a slippery feel to the ground in some
Yes.
areas.
In the
So,
snow, especially. I mean, I grew up in snow in the San Gabriel Mountains, and you can hardly navigate through this stuff. It's horrible. So these cool downs are absolutely engineered. Chinese scientists openly announced this. And Tracy and Shane, if your listeners search Chinese scientists create artificial snowstorm, Popular Science covered it, Fox News, MSNBC, everybody covered it. But you bring it up here, and suddenly you're marginalized. So again, people need to do some actual research. And bottom line, from any perspective, there's no legitimate discussion about climate anything without addressing climate engineering first.
so this unusual fog is intentional from climate engineering, or is it like a side effect? I'm not sure why they would this weird heavy fog that leaves a greasy residue.
What we would safely say at this point, Tracy, certainly it's connected to climate engineering. And because we have radically increased surface temperatures, and we do, and again, this is not a vote for Al Gore. I have great disdain for Mr. Gore. He's a part of the problem. All the environmental groups the same. But the bottom line is anybody who says surface temperatures aren't rising is wrong. And if we looked at climate engineering alone, even if we pretend no other form of human activity has an effect on the planet, we can cut down the forest, pave the planet, 100 million barrels of carbon fuel burnt a day, 26 million tons of coal a day. Even if we pretend none of that has an effect, which isn't true, but let's pretend for a moment. Climate engineering is a human activity, is it not? So climate engineering alone is radically adding to the heating of the planet. It's reducing the planet's natural cloud cover in lieu of ozone destroying particulate clouds. All of that is trapping more heat than it's deflecting. Surface is heating, and now we add chemical ice nucleation. So those contrasting temperatures with the chemical cool down is producing much more fog. And it appears to us at this moment that they are doubling down on their chemical nucleating to create these winter weather events. That's about to happen in Texas. You guys see the forecast that Texas is about to get the big chemical cool down again?
Yes.
Ice storms and snow in Dallas again. Do you guys remember the last big cool down in Dallas? Remember in Texas 2 years ago?
When the
Oh,
electricity
yeah.
also went out and people froze.
Yes. So let's look at that. So then and now, this moisture is coming straight out of the record warm Gulf of Mexico. How do you get a winter snowstorm with moisture out of the record warm Gulf of Mexico? So in the event from I think 2 years ago, 2.5, while Dallas was 0 degrees from the moisture from the Gulf of Mexico, it was 85 degrees at almost the same latitude in Florida. It was 33 degrees warmer at the North Pole than Dallas, Texas. Think about that. So again, the notion that those cool downs are natural could not be further from the truth. We can speculate on the agendas and objectives, but that is engineered winter, period.
So they're doing both, heating up the summers and freezing the winters.
Yes, and on the heating of the summers, thank you, Tracy. That's a really good point. Of the hottest areas under high pressure heat domes, ionosphere heater induced high pressure heat dome creates compressing air, does not allow the heat to escape at night. And that compressing air generates even more heat. And that's how you end up with heat, even in British Columbia. I think 3 years ago on the coast of British Columbia, 121 degrees, killed everything, killed all the mussels on the rocks. I mean, that was 60 degrees above normal, 60. So look at some other place, and if it was 60 degrees above normal, if Phoenix is normal 100 midsummer temperatures 110, 170, and we're getting heat indexes right now, which is the feels like temperature, we're seeing those up as high as 160 degrees. Feels like temperature of 160. And I don't want anybody to believe me. Please research this. And that's the combination of heat and humidity. And Shane, you're probably familiar with that. And Tracy, it's called the wet bulb temperature. So the humidities are rising because of the heat. And now you have conditions that didn't exist before. So if there's too much humidity with too high a temperature, the body can't cool itself. There's too much water in the air, which we didn't have before. So if you have a temperature of, say, 115 degrees with 60 or 70% humidity, again, which didn't exist previously, that's a heat index probably in the 150 or 60 range. And again, your listeners can verify everything I'm stating. I don't want anybody to believe anything I'm saying. Please verify it.
Well, yeah, that does actually slow the rate of evaporation of the sweat,
Yep.
the perspiration from the body, and
Yes.
that slows the rate of cooling as well.
Yes.
Mm,
Exactly right, Shane. Exactly right. And
yeah.
so this is, if the sweat can't evaporate, you have no cooling system, and that's what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah. This past summer was hot on the East Coast and humid in a way I'd never experienced before.
Did you guys see the ocean temperatures last year in Florida hit 102 degrees?
No.
102.
So
And
that
it
kills.
killed
Oh,
everything in that region. And I've been diving since age 14. I've all around the world, and I've seen a lot of the reef damage firsthand, Barrier Reef, Fiji, New Zealand, and people have no idea how bad it is. If the oceans die, we die. And aside from the reefs, the much bigger ecosystem is kelp forests, which I've spent countless hours in over many years. And the kelp forests are 95% gone. US West
Oh,
Coast,
wow.
southern rim of Australia. And those are much bigger systems than even the Barrier Reef. And so again, plankton, the UVs, I'm trying to, everything, so many things come back to climate engineering, and that's not a denial of the bad stewardship we've shown with the earth. We've been horrible stewards of the planet. There's no arguing that. But climate engineering, and especially for the environmental groups to ignore it, is criminal. So the destroyed ozone layer, we're down to about 30% of the ozone layer remaining. The narrative that the ozone layer is getting better is absolutely, completely fictitious. We're getting UVC on the surface now, and we bought state-of-the-art equipment for a former NASA contract engineer who metered for us. The intense UV is killing plankton because plankton has to feed in the upper layers of the water column. They're photosynthesizing. And we have recent peer-reviewed study from the Atlantic, 500 locations, 90% decline in plankton in the Atlantic.
and
Wow.
all
And
these
that
animals
is,
that need to eat all that.
yeah, and that's
Oh
where a
my
lot of our
God.
oxygen comes from.
Greatest single source. Thank you, Shane.
Yeah.
Greatest single source. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's a lot of information, but thank you so much. I always learn so much whenever I hear one of your videos. And for those of you who haven't seen the dimming, please watch it. It was life-changing for me. I watched it a few times, and it, it was life-changing and not necessarily a positive way, because it really it changed my perspective on a lot of things. And I have young children, and so that really, they go out and they'll eat like hail. It hails here, and all these things that I thought were harmless, I feel just much differently about it now.
On that note, Tracy, and I can only imagine what you feel as a mother. And I mean, I feel toward my children as a father very strongly, but that life form having come from you, I can't imagine how deep that feeling is. And what I would suggest for all of us is to keep our faith and philosophy polished. And on the philosophy end, as the Stoics would say, to remember what's in your control and what's not, and to focus on what is. And for me, the only solace I've ever known has come from fully facing this storm head on, not hiding in my cabin on the Titanic. Face it head on. And that's where solace comes, knowing that whatever happens, that you've done your best to make a difference, and no one can take that from you. No one can take our will. And I would argue again, if we all faced this darkening horizon with that kind of unyielding tenacity, we could yet make a profound difference, even at this late hour. And you do that by effectively and efficiently sharing credible data. That's the key to the door. And don't overreach. Don't start conversing about something you're maybe not as familiar with yet. But our printed materials at geoengineeringwatch.org, we pass those printed materials on for less than our cost of producing and shipping. I've spent everything I have on this battle, my SEP account. I sold off assets. I'm not going to need them on the paradigm we're hurtling toward. And that's where philosophy comes in, that we can't, if we allow what we wanted to be to dictate what we do or don't do now, that's a mistake. And again, I would argue that anyone who has dedicated their lives to doing what's right because it's right is on the right path. And however the story ends, it ends well. And if we all did that, who knows what we could accomplish? And if we can stop what's happening in our skies and allow the planet to respond on its own to the damage already done, no one can know, not me, not anybody in academia. No one can know how profound that life support response will be from the planet if we take this geoengineering straitjacket off of it, allow it to respond on its own, and expose this issue to the world and all those behind it.
Well, I do feel a very big shift. I know, like, I'm part of that. This is fairly new to me, but I have people commenting every day that they've now realized what's really going on. And it's a process. It's a difficult process. I've been going through this since the fire, so like a year and a half. And it's turned my life upside down, but I can't go back. And I just want to help as many people get there, but it's very difficult. It's very difficult to get
It takes
people on
courage,
board.
and you've summoned your courage. When I get the chance to connect with people like you and you, Shane, that clearly are articulate, alert, and huge assets in this fight, I'm very grateful. Because when I started this battle on climate engineering 20 plus years ago, I only heard my own voice coming back at me. And now I have the honor and pleasure of connecting with people like you. And again, if you arm yourself with credible data, credible materials, less is more sometimes. Don't try to put the whole tree down someone's throat. Plant the seed, move on, allow that seed to sprout. But the images are worth 1,000 words. We try to supply that at GeoWatch, again, at less than our cost. My mission in this life now is to see this issue exposed and halted and the planet allowed to respond on its own. And if we can do that, we can at least buy time, and that's worth fighting for.
Right. Thank you so much
Amen.
for that, Dane.
Thank
And
you.
yeah, thank you so much for your dedication and for taking the time to be here. Any last things you want to say, Shane? I know we're over time,
He
but
did touch on Stoic philosophy. I don't know the exact quote, but it's about accepting the things that we cannot change, but we must change the things that we cannot accept.
Yes. And another quote, that it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. That's that's the quote. And for
Yeah.
those who are fitting right in today, that's not a sign of health, you know. And I'll leave it with this: the hallmark of a healthy mind is an unyielding willingness to face the truth, no matter how dire. That's a healthy mind, not one that runs from it. So again, it's an honor and a pleasure to connect with you both, and I will remain at my post no matter what. And I look forward to crossing paths again. And I'm very grateful to know that both of you are out there.
absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dane. And thank you for everyone who's tuned in and participated, send questions and send support. A lot of very supportive messages came in when I announced that you're going to be on this channel. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you all soon.